Atari 50 is great, everybody knows that. It was able to tell a good chunk of the Atari story through interviews and history lessons, all while compiling more than 100 games across a dozen different consoles and computers. Now, nearly 2 full years after hitting the market, Atari 50 is back with a brand new expansion pack, the Wider World of Atari. This continuation not only offers fresh interviews and archival images, but also adds another 19 games to the package, bringing the total number of games up to 134. Is that reason enough to be excited for this expansion pack? Well, that's what we're about to find out when I review Atari 50, the Wider World of Atari. The Wider World of Atari marks the first of 2 planned downloadable content updates for Atari 50, both of which are designed to bring more stories, history, and games to the already stuffed compilation. This one dives even deeper into the origins and lore of Atari's early days, all while introducing us to more of the people involved and focusing on the impact that Atari had on young developers and the homebrew scene. Right off the bat, you'll find that the Wider World of Atari introduces a brand new timeline to the compilation. Much like the other timelines, the stories are all told in chronological order, starting in 1976 and going all the way to present day. We learn about the birth of the hugely influential game Breakout, which helps to tie both Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak into the story. We go deeper down the rabbit hole of vector graphics and why they're timeless. And we're introduced to Evelyn Cito, who brought her art and designs to both the home and the console sides of the company. Some of the most exciting content comes late in the timeline, when the game starts to revolve around the games that were impacted by the Great Games Crash of 1983. As you can imagine, there were games that were in active development when the bubble burst, some of which are seeing the light of day for the first time in this collection. It also goes into greater detail about how some of the Atari 2600 games were pushed back to the late 80s and even into the early 1990s. Honestly, this was the first time I'd ever really considered the 2600 games that were released after the Nintendo Entertainment System helped to resuscitate the games industry in the United States. This package includes Moto Rodeo, which was among the last cartridges released for the Atari 2600. That game came out in 1991, the same year the Super Nintendo arrived in the States. That's wild. I also really love how the timeline goes into greater detail about the homebrew scene that sprung up in the 1990s and 2000s. This package really focuses on the fan-made games and Atari's reaction to that movement. For example, we get Adventure 2 by Kurt Vendel, a fan of the original with no connection to Atari. This is one of those occasions when Atari could have easily swooped in and killed the project dead in its tracks, which almost happened. But fate had a different outcome in mind. Atari officially embraced it, helping to grow the homebrew community. Look, I get it. I understand that this is an Atari compilation designed to make Atari look good. But come on, can you imagine any other company taking this approach? What do you think Nintendo would do if they learned that somebody was working on a new Urban Champion game? Yeah, I think we all know how that story ends. Of course, the big news is that this expansion pack adds another 19 games to Atari 50's already massive roster. Most of these games come from either the early arcade days or the Atari 2600, with several on both. Avalanche, for example, is a game that pulls this off. It was delightfully tense as an arcade game, and retains a lot of that when shrunk down to fit on the 2600. The same is true for Skydiver, which was an addictive little arcade game and a solid enough home console port. Off the Wall is an interesting take on the Breakout formula, while Atari Video Cube offers a unique take on the Rubik's Cube. Another 2600 game is Desert Falcon, which is a bird-themed shoot-'em-up that will immediately remind you of games like Viewpoint and Zaxxon. Now, one of the games that really surprised me was Destroyer from 1977, a simple arcade game that has you dropping and detonating bombs underwater in order to defeat a bunch of submarines. It's a simple enough premise, yet the gameplay has enough depth to keep you hooked. It also has a gorgeous arcade cabinet that translates well in this package. While not nearly as good, Submarine Commander on the 2600 shows Atari toying with unique variations on the target shooting theme. And then there's Steeplechase, a 1981 oddity that allows 4 players to race horses at the same time. That's a cool idea, but the execution left me a little cold. Thankfully, there are some real winners in this grouping, including the surprisingly addictive Red Baron. This is an aerial dogfighting game released in the arcades in 1981 that uses vector graphics to create a genuinely exciting action game. I was legitimately shocked at how well this game held up, especially compared to a lot of the other arcade games in this collection. I also love the various versions of Berserk that were included in this package. Much like Red Baron, here's an arcade game that managed to hold up remarkably well, and the Atari 2600 port is so much better than it has any right being. There's also a fun version of Berserk that adds voices back into the Atari 2600 version, which, as we learned through a video, was a lot more complicated than it sounds. And if you get bored of all those variations, you should also check out Frenzy, the equally exciting arcade sequel that was first released back in 1982. For as good as those games are, there were a few that left me both confused and frustrated. Atari's early arcade take on football is a perfect example of that. With characters represented by simple X's and O's, I spent far too long trying to figure out just how to pick a play. Look, I'm sure this game works a lot better as an actual arcade cabinet, where the instructions are better laid out and the trackball control makes sense. But it just did not work in this compilation. Sadly, the same is true for Superbug, an overhead racing game from 1977. I so wanted to love this early driving game, but even after getting a hang of the controls, I found it to be frustrating and hard to play. Again, I have a hunch that things would be different if I were actually to play it on an original arcade cabinet. While I love the variety of the late generation 2600 games and some of the rarer arcade titles, part of me is frustrated that once again the Lynx and the Jaguar get short shrift. There have been homebrew games released for the Jaguar, so it would have fit right in with Adventure 2 and Berserk voice enhanced. It's especially disappointing because the next expansion pack is dubbed the First Console War, giving me pretty much no hope that we're ever going to see any more 64-bit games added to this compilation. That's a shame, because there really are a lot of games for both systems that I'd like to see in the collection. It's especially frustrating because it's extremely rare to see Lynx and Jaguar games emulated anywhere. So this really does feel like the only chance that we'll ever have to see these titles. As far as I'm concerned, both of these systems deserve their own expansion pack. As with any collection of games, your enjoyment is largely going to come down to how interested you are in the titles being offered. For me, the 2600 games is a little hit or miss, while the arcade games were mostly solid. What makes this expansion pack worthwhile are the video interviews and the historical information. Even if you aren't a huge fan of, say, Superbug or one of the other games, it's still a lot of fun learning about them and seeing how they fit into the Atari story. That, along with genuinely great titles like Adventure 2 and Red Baron, make this an essential update to one of the greatest video game compilations of all time. The first of 2 planned expansion packs for Atari 50, the Wider World of Atari is a little unfocused and scattered, but it brings with it a lot of history and some truly great games. This is a worthwhile companion piece that introduces us to the new faces, dives into the world of homebrew, explores the origin of Breakout, and even gives us a rare glimpse at some of the previously unreleased games on the Atari 2600. While I found a few of the games to be incredibly hard to play on the standard gamepad, and I would have liked more games for the Lynx and the Jaguar, there's no question that this is a quality expansion that makes the already great Atari 50 that much better. Hey, thanks for watching my review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that I post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What classic console deserves a comprehensive game collection? If you ask me, I'd go with basically any Sega console that isn't the Genesis. I'm talking about the Master System, the Saturn, the Dreamcast, the 32X, the Sega CD. All of them except for the Genesis. Guys, we've already had a Genesis set. We've been there before. Alright, let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a brand new Review Crew episode. What will it be? Well, you'll find out soon enough. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.